Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Yiling Yi Lu. I'm a professor from City University of New York, John Jay College. This is a research done by myself as well as two colleagues from Lanzhou University in mainland China. The main research question of this research is in what ways are decisional divergence, in what ways are there decisional divergences of a performance budgeting reform? Being at an international conference like this, I'm sure you have wondered before whether terminologies like performance budgeting mean the same thing for presenters from different parts of the world. The truth is we don't know, and it lacks clarity. Some research identify broad or partial convergence of international trend, while others identify the divergences in reform purposes, orientations, practices, and inclusiveness. So why is that? I think many research was done at a country level with broader strokes, and some may not share the same analytical framework. In addition, findings differ based on ways of research. Research emphasizing basic reform concepts and the initial adoption stage of reform tends to be concluding there are a lot of convergence, while others focusing on political values, cultures, government structures, and the full stages of management reform tend to depict otherwise. So to us, the real challenge is to unpack the asterisks. As Paulette nicely, pointed out nicely, the principal problem in cross-country comparison studies is that research shows tables with asterisks denoting which countries have adopted reform A or Y, but reform X or Y, but it's very hard to know exactly what they signify, whether one asterisk is equal to another, or whether the adoption is a brief flirtation or a deep, meaningful relationships. So this research addressed this challenge in 3 ways. Drawing from decades of experiences between countries to look at their respective implementation path. Second, apply the same analytical framework. And third, exploring the subnational performance budgeting practices beyond the national level. As you might suspect, widespread subnational performance budgeting practices often signify maturity of reforms and provide breadth and depth via much more cases of observations. In this study, we focus on the comparison between US and China, 2 countries with dramatic different governance structure. So, before we dive into any details, I would like to point out that Paulette provided a nice convergence conceptualization. There are 4 kinds: discursive, decisional, practice, and the results. For the purpose of this research, we focus on decisional convergence. That is about the characteristics of foundations of a reform when authorities publicly decide to adopt a reform. So how do we compare foundations of a reform across countries? Well, we actually have a framework, and that looks like this. We draw heavily from many scholars before us, including prior work of our own team. And our framework of performance budgeting includes 4 components: measurement, the presence of a valid, reliable, useful, and a timely measurement. Integration, that is the way to connect the dots between prioritization of strategic goals, budgets, and performance management, performance measurement, and accountability, which is whether or how performance information is used in decision making and possibly holds governments accountable for their own performance. Last but not least is examining the shared responsibility of various stakeholders in several key aspects of a performance budgeting. All right. So with this framework, our hypotheses are also 4 of them, one for each component. The first one is we hypothesize there are high level of convergence on measurement because it's the first order of business in performance budgeting. At the same time, we hypothesize the Chinese performance measurement is more prescriptive in what gets measured, but less developed in advanced measurement features such as benchmarking than the American system. The reasons we hypothesize that is because China has a strong planning emphasis, and they are very good at putting out guidelines, and they have a strong desire to be in control. So that's why we hypothesize it's more likely to be prescriptive. Because they are the latecomers into this performance budgeting reform, and that's why we hypothesize they are less likely to have a more advanced features. Second hypothesis is China model features more integration with budgets, but less with government-wide strategic planning than the US model. Third, we hypothesize accountability probably is the largest divergence among 4 components. Why? Because the accountability tools in China are significantly different than those in US. We hypothesize the Chinese model will be emphasizing the incentives and sanctions, while the US model is the role of citizens. Last but not least is the cultural element. Compared to the China model, US model is more likely to have shared responsibilities in performance budgeting. That means more cultural integration or orientation for performance. So how are we going to do this research? We have data source from 2 countries, and in the US, we pretty much adopted Catherine Willoughby and myself's model. We have 40 states with performance budgeting laws, and we have that comprehensively for close a decade. And in China, we collected fresh data by this research team from government websites and the comparative database from Beijing University in 2020. The outcomes, we have about 1 public law, 24 relevant regulations, and 219 performance budgeting foundations issued by 31 provincial government. We did a content analysis, and inter-rater consistency is about the 96%. Any remaining differences were reconciled. So the first step we did is a evolutionary analysis of the implementation path of different countries. Now, I won't bore you with the details, but we did include in our paper how these 2 countries have gone different paths, although they have the same idea of a performance budgeting. I would emphasize, though, is the most striking difference between these 2 countries lies in their key stakeholders. China model emphasized the Ministry of Finance. Also, they differ in the purposes. The China model is mainly to control the budget via performance, and they differ in their strategies. The China model has a lot of standardization and authority in performance evaluation by the central government, compared to the US has been more decentralized and try to include as many participants as possible. Now this is so if I have to summarize at the national level, for the past 15 plus years, China has upheld the spirit of performance budgeting, but operated with more divergence from the US model than convergence. Now, here is the speed at the subnational government level. One difference is that many states in US have explored performance budgeting before the 1993 GPRA Act. However, China, no province has issued official performance budgeting foundations until the national guidelines issued in 2003. So the ensuring diffusion of a performance budgeting foundations across the states is about 1 state per year between the 25 years from 1993 to 2018. and has not reached all states as of 2020 yet. On the other hand, China has seen a rapid increase in the number of provinces adopting performance budgeting foundations, reaching 100% coverage during the short 10 years between its initiation year in 2003 and 2014. So in short, China registers a higher speed of performance budgeting diffusion at the subnational level than the US. So how do they differ in terms of the four components we just talked about? The number one divergence, as we suspected, is at the accountability component. They are differ, 86%. And the reason is that in the US legal foundations, they are very wary about the validity of performance budgeting measurement. And that's why they have safeguards in place and actually urge people to double check the validity of the measures and updating performance information before they really use it. Versus the China model is they are heavy on control and they're heavy on accountability rhetoric. They wanted to emphasize, it's sort of, if you wanted to use the funds, you have to demonstrate performance. If you cannot demonstrate performance, you cannot use the funds. So very heavy accountability focuses. And that's why you will see that's 86% of divergence.
Hey, Elaine, three minutes left. Okay.
Yes. Yes, thank you. The second largest divergence is in measurement. And this is surprising to us because we were thinking about the China model will have less advanced features. However, based on their foundations, it's not true. Their foundations include all kinds of benchmark targets and the technical oversights of agency measurement. And the other two aspects, integration and culture, US and China are similar in a way that both of them are struggling in terms of what is integration, what does performance culture look like. However, one thing that China stands out is that China's strategic plan is done by a different agency than the budget, which is the center, which is a key player in performance budgeting. So anything related to strategic plan, as you can see here, are not linked to budget or performance measurement in the foundations of a performance management. Now, what does that mean for thinking about transferability of a performance budgeting and international trends? I think one thing we learned from this research is definitely we need to unpack the asterisks, right? Different countries means different thing when they talk about performance budgeting. And second, both systems contain all elements of the performance budgeting framework, but more decisional divergence than convergence between US and China. The more divergence show up in accountability and the measurement. And also we wanted to, we kind of realized that China has a lot of adoptions by their own choice. Adaptations by their own choice. The number one adaptation is they're very strong on central design.
1 minute.
The role of central government. Then they also have more adaptations. The last thing I wanted to say is that a lot of people say China's economic reform is like the M shape. A lot of people participated and the entrepreneurship is very high. What we would say in this reform of core institution rules is the tier reform hierarchical structure. That's what we come up with. What that means is central design from the top with a strict vertical implementation among subnational governments with little variances. So there's a complete difference between the way they reform between economic reform and institutional reform. This also casts doubt on the applicability of Western administrative reform theories to non-Western countries, particularly in Asian countries where a state-centric framework is very much alive. So I will stop here and thank you very much, Dr. Hauser. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Right on time. So, good measure. So, okay, let's go back to Cadre. Can we load your slides now?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
loading her.
Okay.
Can you see?
Yes, I think we can see it. So I'll turn the screen over to Cadre in terms of her presentation on agents or stewards. So,
Yeah.
so please go
Okay.
ahead. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that technical problem. I'm Jie Gao from Department of Political Science, National University of Singapore. I'm going to talk about China's approach to performance management with a focus on how the reform approach has changed in Xi Jinping's era. Different from Professor Lu, just about a very specific perspective of performance budgeting reform, I think my presentation is overall view about China's reform approach. So as the title shows, I actually try to use this rising debate about the principal agent versus the principal steward theories to examine China's reform approach. And from that perspective, I try to look for some generally accepted performance principles. Next slide, please. So this is my argument. So China's overarching approach to performance management has been to develop a principal-agent relationship within a principal-steward system, and then to find ways to reconcile the tension between the two. Next slide, please. This chart illustrates my argument. So the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has been using a cadre management system, which is by nature a stewardship system that emphasizes political loyalty, patronage, and unity. Before Xi's time, a major effort of China's performance management reform has been to turn the party's stewards to the agents. This is manifested by wide adoption of performance contracts at various levels of the hierarchy, and then use largely extrinsic incentives to motivate local officials to accomplish the contracts. So this reform approach actually addressed a lot of longstanding issues in China's political system, but it also gave rise to some classic agent problems. So in this context, Xi's performance management reform approach tried to reassert the value of the stewardship system and take this as a remedy to the agent problems. Next, please. I focus on China's target responsibility system, which is the most influential performance management instrument in local governments. The TRS has been institutionalized in local governments at all 4 levels at a nationwide scale. It's similar to most performance measurement systems in other countries. So here is an example of a performance contract local governments signed under the TRS. So the TRS measures organization performance, but it holds individual leaders responsible for the results. The TRS is also officially connected to the CCP's Cadre evaluation system. So it's the most appropriate system to examine the nexus between the agent and the steward theories in China's context. Also next, please. Recent years, the popular principal agent model has been criticized by its limitation to explain bureaucratic behavior. For example, agents as rational actors, they're mainly driven by self-interest. They act opportunistically and they need to be monitored strictly. But in reality, there are problems like the more monitoring regulation put in place, the more likely that the agent will look for areas which are not regulated, and they game the system a lot. So in that context, the steward system has been proposed as an alternative framework. Its core assumptions all differ from those of the agent model. The stewards are motivated by collective or social goals. They're also driven by intrinsic motivation, such as a public service motivation. The interests and the goals of the stewards may coincide with those of their principals, so they do not necessarily clash. The stewardship model also emphasizes loyalty, respect, and the mutual trust between the two sides. So based on the two models, actually, they studies differentiate 2 types of regimes. There are contract-based regimes, which are commonly found in Anglo-American democracies, and also the trust-based regimes, which are in some European and Asian countries. So I have to say that the two models, of course, are not dichotomous. So most systems, they use a mix of the two models. Next, please. So China's overarching approach to performance management before Xi's era is to turn stewards to agents. The CCP's Cadre evaluation system has been featured by informal patron-client networks and emphasized political unity, loyalty to superiors, selfless devotion, shared goals and values. In the reform era, the CCP has been increasingly emphasized the importance of work performance in cadre management, in local government management. So they also made a continuous effort to develop a cadre evaluation system. So this is, of course, to try to strike a better balance between political patronage and work performance in cadre management. So to put a very long story short, the TRS is the tool to measure work performance of local governments and the local leaders in these 6 general categories. The TRS use top-down assigned targets, but local governments can tailor these targets to local situation. Next, please. The TRS established a typical principal-agent relationship. Government at different levels sign performance contracts. They use extrinsic incentives such as performance-oriented bonuses. Performance is also linked to cadre's career prospects. The principals also use some methods to bring the goals of the agents in alignment with their own goals. For example, they give the most important targets veto power in performance evaluation. Okay, next, please. So the TRS indeed addressed these problems in China's political system. For example, it reduces the opaqueness and the dominant role of personal power in cadre management. It strengthens policy compliance at local levels. It also produces useful information for decision-making. But on the other hand, it also causes a lot of classic agent problems. For example, information distortion has been widespread in local levels. The TRS promotes pragmatism, which kind of erodes the ideological correctness of local cadre corps. So gradually, the implementation of the TRS actually gave rise to this impossible contract problem, because more and more competing and the conflicting tasks are written into local government's performance contracts. Some targets inevitably they become very unrealistic, and the local agents, as well as their principals, both of them do not have the prerogatives to vary contracts. Also, as a result, gaming has also become prominent at local levels. Next, please. So when you have both models in the same system, then you see the tension. For example, how should the performance and the patronage be balanced in cadre management? How can local agents be focused on results without losing their professional ethos, political loyalty, and integrity in their work? Is reasserting the principal-steward relationship a remedy to the agent problems? And so how does the Xi's administration respond to these questions? I hope to offer some preliminary observations here. Next, please. The first prominent reform measure in Xi's era is to reduce information asymmetry by tackling data manipulation at local levels. So in key policy areas such as trade, commerce, finance, environmental protection, energy saving, the Chinese national leaders have been investing heavily in strengthening information collection and the monitoring infrastructures. In addition, both national authorities and the local governments collaborate with the independent third-party organizations in data collection, which greatly reduce data manipulation. Next, please. Another measure is to reform the TRS and the cadre evaluation system so as to relieve some stress that the TRS has imposed on the cadres. This involves abandoning the centralized elements in the TRS and reducing the importance of economic performance in deciding cadres' career prospects. So some concrete measures here. Firstly, Xi's administration ceased the practice of providing a national level design for TRS. This is a sharp contrast with his predecessors. Xi's administration only released guiding thoughts on how to improve political achievements evaluation of political achievements instead of work achievements. But at least in theory, this helped to reduce the problems caused by the use of top-down assigned targets in local governance. In addition, the TRS also should promote quality, efficacy, and the sustainability of China's development. For example, it should give higher weight to targets such as poverty reduction, ecological environmental improvement, and the people's feeling of happiness. Also, analysis of Cadre's political achievements must be comprehensive, which also means that economic performance such as GDP, which has been placed at the center of Cadre evaluation, now should not be used as the primary criterion in Cadre management. Okay, next please. The third salient feature of SIS reform is that party building has been prioritized in local Cadre's performance evaluation. This is clearly reflected in the changes of several key documents on Cadre management, which emphasize the importance of establishing a high quality Cadre team with cadres who have firm beliefs to serve the people, diligent and practical in work, willing to take risks, and honest and upright. So under such central guidelines, local authorities have developed more detailed measurement of party building in their own TRS. Some localities make party building or target with veto power. They also begin to implement a so-called ideological responsibility system, which requires ideological correctness to have the same or even more weight as other criteria in Cadre evaluation. Next, please. So this is an example of how party building is measured under the TRS in SIS era. So this is a district of Zhejiang province. So I don't go to the details, it's just an example. Okay, next please. So taken together, SIS reform emphasized the value of the stewardship system that has contributed to the success of the CCP rule. The TRS treats local cadres as agents, while SIS reform reasserts that they are also the party's stewards. Agents are driven by self-interest, but stewards may sacrifice themselves for the greater cause. In SIS' own words, which I quote here, cadres should hold the spirit that it is fine if the success of a great cause is not achieved in my time. Okay, next, please.
3 minutes to go.
Sure, this is my last slide. So going back to the question of the panel, what are the generally accepted principles? I think maybe two things. Firstly, the stewardship system might offer an alternative solution to the agent problems, which are commonly seen in performance management systems everywhere. But of course, each country has its own understanding of stewardship, what stewardship means, and how to develop such a system in its particular national context. Secondly, a related point here is performance and patronage are not necessarily irreconcilable. I do not actually show that in this presentation, but there is a rising number of empirical studies show that leaders with informal ties to their superiors deliver significantly better economic performance than those without. Okay, so in that regard, I think maybe one takeaway message is the two models, agents versus stewards, should not be taken as opposite to each other, but they can be complementary to each other. The question is how the two models can be reconciled in the same performance management system. And I hope my presentation provides a case of China. Okay, that's all about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Cadre. Okay, so we'll now move to Mira Rajiv Kumar, interweaving concepts and approaches to undermine India's Atmar and Nibhar, etc. So, Mira, you have the screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Very much. Yeah. Can I add the screen? Yeah. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Very good morning. Very good morning to the chair and to all the participants. My concept is on interweaving concepts, and my paper is on interweaving concepts and approaches to undermine India's Atmanirbhar, a theoretical study through the principles of public performance management. What I wish to cover in this is what exactly is Atmanirbhar, what's the primary purpose, the effectiveness of Atmanirbhar, the impediments involved, and the utilization of various policy models for effective reach to the citizens. First and foremost, what is this Atmanirbhar? It's a Hindi word, and you call it as self-reliant. And this was actually used by our Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and it came into vogue during this pandemic. But initially, it was started in the year 2014, May. But the word was to boost the economy, pursuing policies that are efficient, effective, and resilient, especially during this COVID time. So when the entire world stooped down owing to the pandemic, India wanted the people to know.
Arun.
Yes.
We
Yes,
lost.
yeah, I think we've lost her. I'm trying to message.
Can you bring it
Maybe-
back?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to contact her. She's still there, but she's not.
So Gaji, I think, no. Mira?
I'm sorry. I think there was a connectivity issue.
We can get back on track, Mira.
Yes.
So Arun, what do you need from Mira?
Maybe she can just without the video, she can present without the video. Would that help?
Hello.
Or if I share the slides.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So can I continue with the slide?
I think the slide is back on.
So it is to boost the Indian economy. That was how the Atmanirbhar, it's not shared.
No, we can view the slide.
We can see this.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, okay, fine. Okay, so sorry. Okay, so my research questions were, what was the purpose behind the concept of Atmanirbhar? What are the areas to be focused under, that was focused under the scheme, and economic impediments faced under this particular scheme, and the role of public performance management under the scheme, and the kind of policy models and approach that can be utilized to make it more effective. So we focus on the 5 I's of India, which is the intent, inclusion, innovation, infrastructure, and investment. So without these 5, I think we cannot progress towards economic development. A country should have the intent to progress, and people should be quite innovative, and infrastructural facilities should also be ample with good investment, and there should be a societal inclusion. So without differentiation between any kind of sections or classes. So we build a self-reliant India. So that was the concept behind this Atmanirbhar. And Atmanirbhar, as it is called, is Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. It focuses on business, which includes MSMEs, that is the micro, small, and medium enterprises. And it focuses on the farmers, all the farmers, the poor farmers, and more on agriculture. What are the new horizons of growth, and what are the reforms of the government, and how we can, that is a concept behind this particular Atmanirbhar, where they have focused more on the local manufacturers and the service providers. So if we have to increase the business of the MSMEs, we have to produce the products within the country. That is a major concept. And then how we can strengthen the economy and improve the standard of living. So once you make the people self-sufficient and self-reliant, so automatically there would be an improvement in the standard of their life. And moreover, there can be an improvement in the trade deficit, and the exchequer balance can also increase, because when imports are being reduced and more of exports are being focused, so there will be a more of trade surplus. So that was the intention behind this Atmanirbhar. And so fiscal stimulus will revive the economy from demand and supply to manufacturing. So this was the concept. So we had the 5 tranches. That is, I move ahead with the 5 tranches. So this is how the Atmanirbhar package breakup went on to. That is, the tranche 1 says that there will be relief measures worth rupees 5,94,550 crores and includes a funding for the MSMEs. And then relief measures worth rupees 3,10,000 crores with focus on the migrant workers, because during the pandemic, it was the migrant workers who actually suffered. And the farmers were also suffered because there was no transportation within the state or within the district. So that was a problem. And then the street vendors and the poor people. So that was, they had focused on this particular aspect. And then a relief measure of rupees 1,50,000 crore. This was for the dairy, animal husbandry, and fisheries. So almost they had focused on the lower sections of the society, where they want to strengthen their economy through these 3 groups. And the 4th tranche was rupees 48,100 crore worth was given to the higher sector, that is the coal, minerals, defense production, airspace management, and all these, atomic energy. So total sustenance. So they focused on the sustenance of the entire economy, focusing on labor, where I can say which are the sectors that can be benefited from Atmanirbhar. Now, these are the ones they say FMCG, that's in again, you have the sector there, the healthcare, technology, financial, communication, chemicals. So all these aspects, all these sectors will be allocated 81,000, 61,000. So, you have a set which they have focused. And funding, and yeah, that is a tranche. That is again our thing. Okay, so did we have an impediment? Do we have an impediment of Atmanirbhar? Of course. What is it? Echoes India's pre-liberalization stance. That is, in 1991 was a new industrial policy that was brought in. So where we had the liberalization, privatization, and the globalization entering the country. So now when we have the self-reliance, actually, so we move on to the pre-liberalization stance. So how far are we going to be successful is going to be a question. Second thing, now India's manufacturing sector will become quite uncompetitive if the government does undertake the opening of various sectors to public enterprises, because we do have certain public enterprises which have to be revived. So we need to club with the private enterprises. So are we really going to club these two together, or are we going to give completely handover to privatization? So that's another one. The third impediment, okay, so that is about the employment opportunities. Will everybody get employment, or are only the lower sections of the society, like the farmers, or these people like the MSMEs, the skilled workers, all of them, they are they the only section who are going to enter into employment? So what happens to the student? See, students are the ones who have always suffered now because of the, I can say, the closure of the colleges, the schools, and everything. So what the government wants is, they want to put them into the skill development. So they have initiated a lot of project funding towards skill development. Skill opportunities are being given to them. So these are the economical hassles faced under the Atmanirbhar. Now, how is it going to affect the effectiveness of public performance management? So the first one I talked about was a managerial ineffectiveness. So this is how the hierarchy. So will everybody, like we have the 3-tier system, the union, the state, and at the district level. So how are they going to work on all these aspects? So that matters. So managerial ineffectiveness, does it prevail? That does, because when the duty is being passed on or delegated, naturally there will be a sort of ineffectiveness prevalent. Then we have inappropriate objective setting in various levels. See, the union government sets a particular objective. So when it passes on to the state level, the objective varies. Then when it moves on to the district level, again, the objective varies. Department-wise, the objectives and goals are different. You take the ministries, they are different. So completely, the government has to focus on the sustenance of the entire system. So that is the main thing. So inappropriate objective setting is indeed, which can affect the performance management. Third one is varying expectations and outcomes. So people have different outcomes. They expect a lot, but then when it comes to the outcome, it's absolutely different. Then the fourth one is inability to identify and evaluate individuals on behavioral elements. So it's difficult to characterize how to meet the demands of the people, because now we have a lot of inflation going on here. There's a lot of price rise, vegetables, fruits, the meat products, everything, it's absolutely, the prices are inflated. So we have to identify the behavioral elements. Then diminishing frequency of scrutinizing the objective setting. So they try to implement, but then how far it reaches the people, that's a big lacuna that we face. So that absolutely deals with the performance of the country as a whole. Then intensive check on meritocracy, fairness, and equity. Are all the people enjoying this, or is it only one particular society which is enjoying this? So that's one aspect. Or is it only based on the merit the government is issuing? Now, we had during the pandemic, we had the public distribution system providing all the people literally 15 kgs of rice, then 5 kgs of sugar, pulses, cereals. So it was completely, there was a fairness, but then how are we going to prolong?
Hey, three minutes.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So then comparative study of public performances in the past and the present is required. So we need to study how it was during the pre-liberalization phase and present. So that is very important for the government to work on. So when I was thinking about all these aspects, I thought, why don't we have certain concepts and approaches like the group theoretical model, elite theoretical model, and the institutional model? So if Atmanirbhar is where the government wants a self-reliant India, it has to be implemented through these three models. Because an equilibrium, if you take up to the group theoretical model, there is always a struggle among the people in the society. And that is what the politicians always want. There should be a struggle. So it's only then they want to implement, right? But then an equilibrium has to be maintained. It has to reach between the government and the public where a good understanding prevails. So a group theoretical model can be implemented. An elite theoretical model. Now here, there is a concept where we have a governing elite and the counter elite. So there is something called as a waterline that exists between the governing and the counter elite. So governing elite are the people who win the competition. So they become the private companies who actually win the competition. And the counter elite are the other people who do not win the competition yet. They want to find means to displace the governing elite, where they have a strong force on the government. And the last
one
is
more
an
minute.
Yes, sir. Institutional model, where we need to establish a pattern of human behavior consisting of structured interaction within the framework of the relevant values. So we need to have a regularized patterns of behavior when we need to focus on the rules, the regulations, and the structures. So ultimately, public performance management, we need to focus more on it to make this Atmanirbhar very effective. So I wish to end my presentation by saying innovation. It is a quote given by the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, who says innovation for the people and by the people is the direction of our new India. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mira. I certainly agree with you that we need innovation, and we need it more worldwide, and we need it more in the US. So let's move now to Jane Beckett Camarada. Jane is one of the enduring scholars in our field who has made major contributions to performance theory and to the observation of practice, and papers on establishing generally accepted performance principles, or GAP, and practices for infrastructure finance policy in Mauritius. So Jane?
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be, what I'm presenting this morning is from a larger study which resulted in a book, excuse me, and so I'm going to be talking this morning about best principles and practices in Mauritius infrastructure finance policy. So the little bit of the background. So in the 1970s and increasing during the 1990s energy crisis, and even more pronounced in the 2008 global financial crisis, many governments are not able to sufficiently finance new capital infrastructure and or repair or replace obsolete capital infrastructure. And few governments have found themselves able to adequately fund capital infrastructure requirements without financing options. So the larger study is about infrastructure finance policy in several countries. And as I said this morning, I'm just presenting on Mauritius. So infrastructure finance policy should be a means to achieve long-term national and subnational policy objectives, and it goes beyond the boundaries. This study goes beyond the boundaries of existing studies. So I'm going to be describing Mauritius finance policy best practice as the basis for identifying potential infrastructure financing sources. So what I did was, in the larger study, I selected a purposive sample of governments that have infrastructure finance policies and policy goals. And one of the things that is different about Mauritius is that they actually have a policy document that you can track, and it goes through the policy document articulating their infrastructure finance policy. Then they have a strategy, and then it steps down to their comprehensive plan, and then to their capital budget. So what I did was I analyzed the documents and from the different governments to come up with the best practices in infrastructure finance policy. So what I have is a roadmap of who's involved, at what point, when and where. And then you'll hear me talk about, in this presentation, public-private partnerships. And one of the key issues with financing infrastructure, particularly because government funding is so tight, is the notion of forming partnerships. And often we see, and I know as a former practitioner, often public-private partnerships are selected in the capital budgeting process because they are they're a contractor will come forward and propose a public-private partnership. And what's unique about the best practice in Mauritius is that the public-private partnerships are you still able to see? Okay. What is different is that they the public-private partnerships are based on an infrastructure finance policy, not from an ad hoc approach in the capital budgeting process. So it's based on identification, selection, implementation, and evaluation of the public-private partnerships within the framework of this strategic infrastructure finance policy objectives and the capital improvement process. So the need for infrastructure finance policy best principles and practices, governments don't recognize the value and the utilization of the best principles and practices in choosing a financing option among several financing options. And, you know, one of the things that we, Dr. Holzer talked about this morning was, you know, the role of government and how often we look to the private sector. And my view is that that we really, rather than to looking towards the private sector, why not form partnerships as opposed to just looking at how we can adopt what they're doing. So the infrastructure finance policy has been insufficiently used as a basis for decision making in using public-private partnerships, and thus it's not necessarily tied to the capital improvements plan to identify the potential and appropriate uses of PPPs. So capital improvements planning includes a number of complex phases, such as the integration of the comprehensive and strategic plan, the capital needs and assessments, project cost estimation, project priority planning, and adoption of the capital budget. And as I said before, often what we find and what I know from experience and from what I know from my research is that we find the use of different funding options showing up in the capital improvements plan and in the capital budget, and not being driven by a policy. So we need that to navigate the complexity. And one of the issues that I have also found in my research is that there's a high need for staff capability in understanding the nuances of infrastructure finance policies, as well as the roadmap for creating and implementing public-private partnerships as a financing option. So, so my first point in this is that in the best practices is the use of public-private partnerships as public policy through an infrastructure finance policy best practice, and it should describe the design and implementation and the legal framework governing PPPs. Because one of the things that I found in terms of the best practices is that there really needs to be a solid legal framework that covers public-private partnerships. Without that, they become problematic. And it offers a way for governments to incorporate public-private partnerships as a policy option to finance infrastructure through the finance policy design and implementation, and really to shape public value, because that is one of the differences between government and the private sector, is that we shape public value, but we can do it in partnership with the private sector. So my second point is that public and private values differ, as I just mentioned, and that affects the role of infrastructure finance policy in shaping public value. And we see that in terms of what types of infrastructure are financed. And again, it's often driven by the financing itself and not by the overall policy. And my second point is that we can show cases where governments use public-private partnerships as a policy option, some more successfully than others based on their infrastructure finance policy design and implementation. As I discovered in Mauritius, they've done an excellent job there in terms of their policy design and implementation, and in using public-private partnerships. They also have an excellent legal system and very well-trained staff. So the infrastructure finance policy, capital management and budgeting processes, and PPPs together are a way of designing infrastructure finance policy and PPPs as a policy option. And also they lay out in Mauritius, they lay out their financing options and the tools for evaluating these options, again, which are critical, such as value for the money. And they illustrate the capital management and budgeting framework and the stages that are the basis for successful infrastructure finance policy implementation. So the best principles and practices are the financial forecasting, independent capital financing option analysis, flexibility during the capital project design, in contract negotiation, infrastructure finance allocation, risk allocation, minimizing risk, defining transaction cost in evaluating public-private partnerships as a policy choice, including public participation and disclosure. Then the role of infrastructure financing, again, is you can see it very clearly in the case of Mauritius infrastructure finance policy. And then I also, although I don't have time to go into it this morning, the political stability and legal framework which supports the infrastructure financing policy is really critical, as well as need for stakeholder involvement in the final decision-making process. And I use specific examples. This is again from this larger study of the financial risk reduction best practices and the best practices in the legal frameworks. So, in conclusion, the best practice in terms of using policy options such as public-private partnerships as an infrastructure finance policy is a case of where we can work with and use private sector efficiency, but not necessarily be trying to copy private sector efficiency. And we can find a better way to manage revenue generation, and in the long run bring public and private sectors together in a long-term symbiotic relationship. And then we as government can focus on providing public value, and citizens can receive more timely, efficient, and effective government goods and services. So my presentation this morning was more just of a general overall policy framework and how we can bring the policy framework together using public-private partnerships. And again, we're seeing this more and more where government really, local, state, and national are really having to form more partnership types of arrangements to finance capital infrastructure. So that concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. So we have spanned the globe with these presentations, and no one is better equipped to comment on what is happening around the globe than Kai-Feng Yang. So Kai-Feng will now join us as a discussant. Not sure from the Askew School at Florida or from Renmin University or whatever, but Kai-Feng, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm actually in a conference room in the paradise. You see, this is a wonderful conference room. It's glad to be here, and it's an honor to be on this panel. The four presentations are very informative. I've learned a lot. To discuss all those four in detail, that's beyond my capacity. I think they are so good, and also they're so different. So I can only perhaps focus on some of the points. The first one, I think it's a comparison between the U.S. and China in terms of performance-based budgeting. I think it's based on the very detailed and systematic work. So I think it's very impressive. At the same time, I agree with Lynn on most of the points. I just want to mention several points, maybe to further clarify this. I think that because this relates to the topic of today, generally accepted principles. When we talk about a concept, a framework, a principle, how generally accepted it is across national cultures. Performance-based budgeting, of course, the same, not exactly the same term as Ellen mentioned, because in China right now, they don't talk about performance-based budgeting. They talk about the performance of the budgeting. It's a slightly different use of term, but the difference is significant for the practitioners. I think that purely a comparison of the documents may, to some extent, maybe misleading on some of the points. One is that it's really, when you compare the performance-based budgeting in two countries, I wonder, the first thing is, what is the game? To me, that when we talk about performance-based budgeting in the US, the game is between the agency and the elected officials, right? But here, I think we see the Ministry of Finance, when they send the inspectors to provincial and local governments, sometimes it's more of a game of the central government, especially Ministry of Finance and local governments. But when we look at the local governments, it's not really a game between the local finance or budgeting people and those like mayor and top management of the city. If you see there is a collusion, it's actually sort of the local top management and budgeters and finance people, they collude, and then they are having a game against the sort of the central administration. That's my sort of the overall impression of this. So what's the game? I want to talk about this. It also applies to JS paper. I will talk about a little bit later. But Lynn's paper has another question I have, that both papers just encouraged me to think more about this issue is in the US, when you talk about evolution of the budgeting system, so you mentioned, for example, Clinton era, and then Bush, and then Obama. There's a difference, I think, that in the Bush era, that's really based on, when we talk about PART system, that's based on really program, right? And then in Clinton era, and then in Obama, I'm not sure that they strictly focus on the program per se. It's more of agency-wide or cross-agency. In China, this difference is more striking in terms that the performance-based budgeting or budgeting decisions are purely finance people. So they run a system. But for the agency performance, this is another system, totally separate. And right now they're trying to integrate those two systems, but it's very difficult because the agency performance and the program performance, they are very difficult to align in China. So even when you think about, yeah, they have measures, but whether that's sort of government-wide measure, agency-wide measure, or it's sort of a program measure, they have very different implications. So I think that you point to some very interesting differences between two countries. And I agree with your conclusion that they are indeed using the same name, but with very different impacts and effects. So I think we can talk more about this, but I think this is an important work to do to have a better understanding of performance-based budgeting across national cultures. The second one, the paper by Professor Gao, this is the second time I listened to this presentation in a very short period of time. It's pretty insightful, and I think it's pretty focused, that it gives you a very good idea about performance management in China before and President Xi's era and the current reform. But I do have one thing is, again, what is the game that when you talk about agent and stewardship? You have to define the terms in a very clear way. What does steward mean? Because in the traditional PA theory, steward means that you actually act on behalf of your principal, that you don't have to listen to his or her voice. You just think that you represent his best interest. For example, you think you represent the public best interest, so you don't have to sort of respond to public opinion all the time. You just, do what you believe what's right. I mean, here I think that in the current time, if you have such strict political control, would you consider this is a game between the bureaucrats and the politicians as the game? Then I don't think that there's a difference between agent and steward. They become even better agents for the politicians, right? If you are talking about this is the game, sort of the principle are citizens, do you really think in the current time there act on behalf of the citizens' public interest? So I think here the concepts got me think very hard about what this means. Another thing is, I think it's also interesting is how do we relate TRS and the general performance management? I understand your definition, so I can go with you. I just want to mention that for most of the practitioners I talked about, they don't think their performance evaluation system are part of TRS. So when I talk to people in Hangzhou, I don't think they think their system is a TRS system. So far, I know that only Guizhou province, they still think their performance system is sort of based on a TRS system. But for Hangzhou and for Beijing, they don't think their system are a TRS system. So because of the experimentation of performance management in China, there are different types of local performance management. So of course, I'm still thinking about this. How should we conceptualize this? Should we consider all of those as TRS, or should we differentiate between them more clearly? That's one issue I have. The last comment on your paper is towards end, you talked about the sort of a balance between
5 more minutes.
Okay, performance and patronage. That's an interesting term because patronage. Because I remember that more recently in the empirical political science or China study literature, they have sort of the empirical measure. Most of the measures are based on political ties, right? For example, whether the superior officials and the local officials, they went to the same high school, the same party school, they shared a similar sort of work experience, so on and so forth. I questioned when I saw those type of measurement. I questioned because that basically means shared ties. So what does patronage mean today in China? I'm not a China study expert, so I'm always wonder about this. Would you say that you have sort of upper networking or sort of horizontal networking or vertical networking? Would you consider that as patronage or not? So I think when you look at the sort of the political science or political philosophy literature, patronage would have so many different meanings. When you use that in the context of China, I think it's still, I think it needs to be defined more clearly. So I think I probably spent most of the time in the two papers relating to China, as I know more about. The third paper, I think also a third presentation, I think is also very interesting. That's a very macro level discussion on performance management in terms of the national economic strategy in India. And I think that given the time, I just want to comment on the last slide in terms of the 3 theoretical perspectives. I think they are very insightful. I need to think more about it in terms of those 3 theoretical frameworks, especially in terms of the elite theoretical model and the institutional model. I think that most of the time that by today we have so much progress made in terms of theorizing in performance management, but still I think the theorizing is insufficient. There are a lot of macro level theories that are not being well applied in performance management literature. So I think that this actually has to be done in the future. So I really am intrigued by those 3 theoretical models. I think they are very helpful. So last but not least, Jim Beck, I think this is a very interesting topic area in terms of the use of PPPs in infrastructure financing. As we see that PPPs are increasingly used in different countries. I know that in China, the central government has implemented the policy, so you see so many PPP projects. But again, you see that the PPP projects are very different from those in other countries. Mm-hmm. On the sort of private side, they are really state-owned companies. So when you look at them, how do you actually measure their performance? Do they really perform well? do they really perform in terms of a comparison with a market provision or the traditional public provision? I think it has a lot of problems. But I also think that this is not only about China, but also in terms of in Western countries. How do you measure performance? How do you ensure the PPPs are performing? I think despite a large literature on this, I think we don't have a very well-designed performance management system or a framework for PPP projects. That's just my overall impression of the literature. But I do think that you raised some interesting macro level variables that I think that we need to think more about it in terms of the political stability, in terms of the legal framework, in terms of the stakeholder, so on and so forth. Given the time, I just want to conclude that I think the 4 presentations are very insightful, and I think that they got me to think that how institutional logics can make a difference in the performance management movement in terms of the generally accepted principles of performance management. I think this is a interesting and exciting area, and I want to thank all the 4 presenters for their very nice, very insightful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kefan. I agree with you totally that these were terrific presentations. We have a great deal to learn from each other, and each one of these has something to offer to the GAP principles that we're trying to develop. So we have an opportunity for 1 or 2 questions at this point. If anyone would like to send a question on the chat, then I'll ask them to unmute and ask it. Any volunteers? Or we'll just give it a moment to see if anybody's typing and wants to direct a message to the panel, either across the panel or to one of the panelists or the discussants. Well, Patria Jones says, thank you for the excellent presentations. Thank you, Patria, for saying that. But it was a statement, not a question. So, well, I will just ask the panelists, if you had one thing you could add to our projected GAP principles, one sentence, what would it be? Let me start. Anybody volunteer? Or so Elaine?
Yes, I know you will call my name, so I volunteer.
Okay.
Well, I think my research was done before the generally accepted performance principle. So I would have to say, after today's conference and the comments I received, I think, just join on Kai-Feng's comment. In order for us to develop generally accepted performance principles, one of the keys is to think about how this fits with the institutional logic. So that's the thing that I'm thinking about it, how this could be done, to cross the bridge so that it could be generally accepted. So that's what I'm thinking.
So Jane?
Well, what I'd like to add is that, while I agree at the micro level that generally accepted accounting principles work, at the macro level, if we're looking at generally accepted principles, I think we have to be mindful that they have to be very broad in scope, much more so than, say, at a granular accounting level.
Good point, Phil. Gauge?
Well, I think I would like to add that you don't have any perfect solutions. So that any reform would bring new challenges and the new problems. So I think the very important thing is you make timely adjustments to performance management systems. So if you see the tension has accumulated to a certain level, you turn to another direction, even though we don't know whether things would work out. But I guess that timely adjustment is important. And also I thank Professor Yang for those very good comments. I think some questions are really hard to answer at this moment, and they're very insightful. Thank you.
That's a good phrase, timely adjustment. So Mira, do you have one point you would like to contribute? So Mira, can I ask you for one sentence? Or? I don't know if she's so. Hey, we're running out of time. So, Kai-Fang, would you like to compliment your brilliant analysis of the presentations with one brilliant statement? You have to unmute. Yeah.
I cannot do that, but I can offer one more comment. In comparing China with other countries, I see one similarity for potential success. It's political commitment. I think that's such an important ingredient. For another thing that I think that is the difference between China and other countries, but I think normatively that's important is transparency. That I think that you need to have the transparency of the results, and that's so important.
Yes. Okay, I want to thank everyone. I'm going to take a little 5 minutes break between panels here, but these were important contributions, and I think that we're going to follow up with these contributions and how they help us define gap. So, so thank you all, and the next panel will convene at 10:30 in 4 minutes.